There is a moment that never comes with warning, no explosion, no dramatic goodbye, no emotional speech. It arrives quietly, almost invisibly. It happens when the person who has spent their entire life giving, listening, absorbing, fixing, forgiving, finally pauses. They look in the mirror, not to judge, not to hate themselves, but to see, and something inside them says, calmly and without emotion, I cannot continue like this. That sentence doesn't sound powerful, but it ends entire lifetimes of self-betrayal. Betrayal. This is the moment Carl Jung spent decades trying to understand, not in surface psychology, but in the deepest layers of the human psyche. Because according to Jung, this moment is not weakness, it is not selfishness, it is not bitterness, it is the beginning of psychological sovereignty. And once it begins, nothing ever goes back to the way it was. The empath's silent contract with the world. Jung noticed something most psychologists overlooked. People with high emotional sensitivity, empaths, don't just care more. They live under an unconscious contract. A contract that says, I will carry what others cannot. I will absorb pain so harmony survives. I will shrink so relationships stay intact. I will stay understanding. Even when misunderstood, I will keep giving, even when it costs me myself. This contract is never signed out loud. It is learned early, through family, trauma, neglect, or emotional responsibility placed too soon on a soft nervous system. Jung called this chronic self-sacrifice. Not kindness, not generosity, but a psychological pattern where the empath becomes the emotional landfill of everyone around them. They regulate emotions that aren't theirs. They fix problems they didn't create. They tolerate behaviors they would never allow themselves to express. And the most dangerous part, they call it love. Why empaths are drawn to the broken according to Jung. The psyche is always trying to complete itself. Empaths often carry an unconscious belief. If I can heal you, I'll finally be safe. So they're magnetically drawn to emotionally unavailable people, wounded egos, narcissists, addicts, chronic victims, people who take but never transform, not because empaths are weak, but because they confuse connection with responsibility. Jung explained this through the concept of projection. The empath projects their own unexpressed strength, boundaries, and authority onto others, then spends their life trying to rescue it back through caretaking. They don't realize they aren't loving people. They are abandoning themselves in exchange for attachment. The point where the psyche revolts here is where Jung's work becomes unsettling and liberating. He said, the psyche will not tolerate imbalance forever. When something is pushed too far in one direction, it must swing back. He called this enantiodromia, the law of psychological reversal. And this is where the empath's transformation begins. Not through confidence, not through motivation, not through affirmations, but through exhaustion. One day, the empath realizes their kindness has been exploited, their patience has been weaponized, their empathy has been mistaken for permission, their silence has trained others to disrespect them, and something cracks. Not into rage, into clarity. This is not an emotional breakdown. Jung called it a psychic crisis, a necessary collapse of a false self, the part of the empath that believed, if I give enough, I'll be valued, dies here. The birth of the shadow. Jung's most misunderstood concept is the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is everything you were never allowed to be. For empaths, the shadow contains the ability to say no without explanation, the capacity to disappoint others, the instinct to walk away, the strength to choose themselves, the willingness to be misunderstood. These traits were repressed early because they threatened connection. So the empath learned, my needs are dangerous, but when the psyche reaches its limit, the shadow doesn't stay buried. It rises, and this is where people get confused. Because when an empath begins integrating their shadow, others say, you've changed, you're cold now, you're selfisher, you're not who you used to be. Jung said this reaction is inevitable. Why? Because the empath is no longer performing emotional labor for free. Why choosing yourself feels terrifying. When an empath begins to choose themselves, it feels wrong at first. Guilt surfaces, fear activates, old programming screams. This is because the nervous system was conditioned to associate safety with self-abandonment. Jung explained that individuation, becoming whole, feels like death to the false self. You're not losing your empathy, you're losing your compulsion to bleed. And the people who benefited from your bleeding will panic, because your silence forces them to face themselves. Psychological sovereignty, the shift that cannot be reversed. Jung made a critical distinction. Selfishness seeks advantage, Sovereignty seeks integrity. The empath who chooses themselves doesn't become cruel. They become self-contained. They stop explaining their boundaries, justifying their decisions, negotiating their worth, begging for understanding, not out of bitterness, out of completion. Jung called this psychological autonomy, the ability to validate oneself without external permission. This is the moment relationships begin to collapse, not because the empath is wrong, but because the dynamic depended on their self-erasure. The withdrawal of projections here is one of Jung's most brutal truths. When you stop abandoning yourself, others lose the ability to avoid themselves. He called this the withdrawal of projections. The narcissist loses control. The manipulator loses leverage. The emotional parasite loses supply. They feel exposed, and they will blame you for it. Jung warned that growth often feels like betrayal to those who relied on your unconsciousness. But this stage is unavoidable, because you cannot be whole and exploited at the same time. The quiet power that terrifies control-based people, true transformation, is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't explain. It doesn't argue. It doesn't argue. The empath simply stops responding. Where there's disrespect, stops giving. Where there's no reciprocity, stops staying. Where there's emotional danger, Jung said this kind of power is threatening because it cannot be manipulated. You can't guilt someone who no longer abandons themselves. You can't control someone who values their peace over your comfort. You can't dominate someone who has faced their shadow. This is not detachment. This is integration. The empath at the edge of wholeness. By the end of this stage, the empath is no longer driven by fear of abandonment, fear of loneliness, fear of being misunderstood. They've discovered something Jung believed was the ultimate goal of individuation, to become one's own safe place. They are no longer drawn to chaos. They no longer feel responsible for fixing others. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. They are becoming complete unto themselves, and this is only the beginning. There comes a stage that very few people ever reach, not because it's rare, but because it requires something most humans avoid at all costs: inner authority. Carl Jung believed that the final phase of human development is not happiness, not success, not approval, but wholeness. And for the empath, this stage is nothing short of revolutionary, because this is where they stop reacting and start existing from a place no one can invade. The difference between boundaries and integration: most people think boundaries are the end goal. Jung disagreed. Boundaries are temporary structures, necessary but not final. The empath initially sets boundaries out of pain. I can't take this anymore. I won't allow this again. I need space. But in the final stage, boundaries dissolve into something deeper: integration. The empath no longer manages boundaries. They embody them. They don't say no because they're afraid of being hurt. They say no because it doesn't align. This is a crucial psychological shift. Jung called it the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to hold opposites without conflict. Holding the paradox without breaking, the integrated empath holds compassion without self-sacrifice, understanding without tolerance of abuse, forgiveness without access, kindness without availability. This confuses people because most humans operate in extremes. If you're kind, you must be weak. If you're firm, you must be cold. But Jung discovered that psychological maturity lives between opposites. The awakened empath is gentle and immovable, open-hearted and unreachable to manipulation, present but not absorbent. This isn't emotional numbness. This is discernment. Why the integrated empath no longer attracts narcissists? This is one of Jung's most fascinating observations. Narcissists, manipulators, and emotionally immature people are not attracted to empathy. They are attracted to unintegrated empathy. They seek people who over-explain over, give over, feel over, responsibilize under, protect themselves. Once the empath integrates their shadow, something changes at an energetic level. They no longer leak emotional availability. They no longer signal, "I'll stay no matter how you treat me." Their nervous system is regulated, their presence is grounded, their energy is contained. Jung would say they have reclaimed their psychic boundaries, and predators sense this immediately. They lose interest or escalate. Either way, the empath is no longer accessible. The end of emotional negotiation. One of the clearest signs of full individuation is this: the empath stops negotiating their reality. They don't convince. They don't chase clarity. They don't argue about what happened. They don't try to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding them. Jung explained that the individuated person no longer seeks validation externally because their identity is internally anchored. This is why silence becomes powerful, not passive-aggressive silence, complete silence, the kind that comes from resolution, not resentment. Loneliness versus solitude. The great reversal early in life, empaths fear loneliness more than pain. So they stay, they endure, they adapt. But something flips after individuation. Solitude becomes nourishing, chaos becomes exhausting. Jung said this reversal is a sign of psychic maturity. The empath no longer needs constant emotional stimulation. They no longer confuse drama with depth. They no longer mistake intensity for intimacy. They become selective, not because they are superior, but because their nervous system demands peace. Becoming one's own safe place, this is the moment Jung described as complete unto oneself. The empath no longer seeks safety in being needed, being chosen, being indispensable, being irreplaceable. They become internally resourced. If someone leaves, they grieve, but they don't collapse. If someone misunderstands, they clarify once, then release. If someone manipulates, they disengage without explanation. They trust themselves, and this trust changes everything. Why the world reacts differently to the whole empath, people sense wholeness, not consciously, but instinctively. The integrated empath is treated differently because they don't overreact, don't overshare, don't overinvest, don't overstay. They don't offer emotional discounts. They don't bargain with their worth. They don't perform kindness for approval. Jung said this kind of person alters relational dynamics simply by existing. They don't chase respect. They set the standard, the sacred shift. From giving to choosing, this is where the misunderstanding ends. The empath doesn't stop caring. They stop bleeding. They still love deeply, but selectively. They still feel intensely, but inwardly anchored. They still help, but only where there is mutuality. Jung believed this was not selfishness.